Hello, beautiful angels. This is the time of the greatest liberation of humanity. It is the time of the greatest salvation of this world, of this realm, not only humanity, but also this entire realm, which includes this planet, which also includes the interdimensional spaces around this planet. What are we being liberated from is a big trap. And that trap had so many layers to it, and it was internal, but also external. So not only have we been fooled, but also internally, we ended up fooling ourselves. It ended up being a very perpetual system, very intricate, very elaborate, and very elaborate hoax. So this is an amazing, amazing, exciting time. I hope to communicate it clearly as I tap into my own divine self, which is something that many of us have been prepared for and worked on for many decades in this lifetime. I, as a meditator, have used many different meditation techniques since I was a child, really. And there are silent meditations, meditations where you move energy through your spine, meditations where you do different types of breathing techniques, meditations where you focus on certain things for a very long time. But I found that working with Orin, which is something that we promote here quite a bit, is an amazing tool for many reasons, which I will explain. For example, when you work with Orin and there is never anything you need to buy, you can simply go to the free meditation room on Orin and Daban. And even if you just work every day with the same tools for the rest of your so-called life, you will have incredible results. And the reason for that is that when you work with Orin, it transforms the personality mind. It makes room for something else. It makes room for the divine self. And it also creates silence of the personality mind. Eventually, when you get really used to working with Orin, you realize that you sit in meditation and that maybe the mind went silent. It takes a while before the mind goes silent, but eventually it is success when it does. And the other thing is about Orin that you are always receiving transmission, not just transmission of energy from Orin, but you actually are constantly receiving huge energetic support from the great ones. We have many great beings in this cosmos, many great beings in this specific universe, many great beings in this specific galaxy, and many great beings that are eternal and omnipresent. And when we work with Orin, Orin is able to gather these beings for us. And so then we receive this big boost of energy. So we don't have to do it ourselves. And that's what I found has been so helpful in this path. As opposed to just sitting and doing silent meditation when the mind is not ready. It's nice to sit and close eyes, but usually the mind is not ready for silence. And so with Orin, we get to eventually have that silence. So to look at the big picture of what's happening and what happened on planet Earth, there have been so many forces, especially the invisible forces, that have been manipulating humanity for a very long time. I had memories of unbelievable manipulation that took place throughout the millennia on this planet, and not just one type of beings, but many types of beings. And of course, you ask yourself, how is that even possible? How would this be allowed? But the thing is that in the cosmic dream, which is what we call Maya, which is something wonderful, which means a big Leela, it's a big play in cosmos. Kind of everything is allowed because it is a cosmic dream. So it's like a big movie, and that movie is just happening. And we already know the final chapter. The final chapter is always a happy end. This cosmos doesn't create eternal suffering. It always comes to a resolution before a new cosmic cycle opens up. And so it's not a problem to the cosmos what's going on at all. And yet everything seems to be allowed. And so within this free will universe, we've had a lot of beings who interfered with humanity, not from the start, but a very long time ago, this interference started. And there are certain periods when the interference and the manipulation became very, very, very present, and it permeated every aspect of our life, except sometimes, hopefully, for our connection with the divine self. So nothing can interfere with the divine self. There is nothing in this cosmos that can ever interfere with the divine self. So that's the great news. There is no duality that can touch our divine self. There is no illusion that could touch our divine self. And so the path that we share here is always, I would say, I want to say actually it is the most reliable path, not because I share it, but because we have a divine self. The divine self is the one and only true self that we have. And so if there is a path that connects us with the divine self, it is the only path that leads to the truth, because the only truth can be found in the divine self. I hope I'm explaining correctly. So that means whatever path leads to the divine self is the path that is the path of truth. It has to lead to the divine self. If it doesn't lead to the divine self, then it leads us into delusion. Hopefully that now makes sense. So, sometimes there are gurus in this world and teachers, they lead people to themselves. But that is an illusion. It doesn't stop in any guru. The true guru is the divine self, and we all belong to a divine self. The light of the divine self is the light of God, and it is light that cannot be interfered with. No one can manipulate anyone at the level of the divine self, and so that's amazing. Think about that. And we don't actually want to be thinking so much, but if we're going to be thinking about something, we might as well be thinking about the divine self. It is the safe haven for all of us. And so I'm going to show a little bit of what I have learned from my own divine self. When I put together these presentations, I always sit with my divine self and I'm just tapping into the divine self to go directly to my own source, because you and me and everyone else, we actually share the same source. And from that one source, which is the absolute, many came into being as the divine self. And so it is the fractals of the divine self as the source. From one came many. The human being is a bit of an illusion within the whole picture, but that's okay. But the divine self is beyond illusion. So when we start working with the divine self, when we start embodying the divine self, when we start calling upon the divine self, when we start truly opening up to the divine self, we go beyond illusion. And again, the most amazing thing about the divine self is that nothing can touch it. Nothing can diminish it. No illusion can cloud the divine self. The only one who can be clouded by delusion is the human person down here in this world. There are many different paths that the mystics have taken in the past of different types of meditation, the Kriya Yoga, that again, it always required breathing techniques. Breathing technique and meditation combined was always the path to the divine self. For example, for Yogananda, it was the Kriya Yoga, where you move through the pillar of light that goes through the spine until that light becomes who you are, when the other self dissolves. And so they all ended, these great teachings, they all landed in the same eternal self. And they had many different names for it. Some people call it divine self. Some people call it I am. Some people call it I am presence. Some mystics call it the self, the true self, self with a capital S. Some call it the sage self. Some people called it God's self. Some people called it source self. Some people called it spirit. It all is the same thing. As we are dissolving here, we are dissolving delusion that kept us, and it's also an illusion, separate from the divine self. Because the light of the divine self gives us existence. It doesn't give us life because life is eternal, so it gives us existence. Our existence. In this world, life is often misunderstood because we also have the term death. And so then it again is an illusion because it seems like we were born, we have life, then we lose life, we don't have life, now we are in the afterlife. Well, that is again part of the delusion because we actually are always eternally existing as the divine self. The divine self is eternally existing. How it came into being, I just had this idea today that when you take source, creator, and it would be like a new box of Lego pieces. It is complete. Everything that is needed is in that box, and that is creator before creation. So creator before creation is like the box of Lego pieces, where everything is within the box. Nothing is missing. It is complete. It doesn't even need to build anything out of itself, but it wants to. It doesn't need to. It's not necessary because it has all the pieces needed within itself. It has a potential though, and it has a potential to play the divine play that we mystics call Leela. So now the creator, for no necessary reason, opens up the box of itself and it spills itself into creation as those pieces of Lego. And now we can start building worlds, and that is divine play. We can build them, we can dissolve them, we can sustain them and then dissolve them, we can change them and keep changing them. That is the divine play. It's entertaining. Is it necessary for the box to do that? No, not at all. The creator never needed to do that. But it had that mystical desire without needing, without wanting. And so that's how creation came into being. And that's how creation is perpetuated still. It's this changing world as well as also unchanging worlds. There are worlds that already have been perfected. There are worlds like ours that has not been perfected. But we are always participating in this change unless we enter the unchanging. And even then, usually we say, you know what, send me back into some changing world because it's so satisfying to be part of the change and to keep improving something that actually already is perfect innately. Again, hopefully that makes sense. So here we are, and we are in a changing world, and we are in a changeable world. But also, there have been those beings who realized that they would like to, out of their own greed, because they were corrupt. So we've had corrupt beings. We even have, of course, corrupt beings in this world. So we know that some beings like to tap into that corruption of their own consciousness. And instead of operating from love, they operate from greed. Instead of operating from love and compassion and oneness, they start really going into that depth of separation, and then they see enemies, and then they want to also use and abuse. So those beings definitely have existed in this cosmos, and those are the beings that are the cause of what happened to planet Earth. Many different types of beings, and again, we talked about them before, but again, this is the time of dissolution of the delusion that they originally created, and then we participated in it. So, creation, this is a picture of, let's say, if you have the entire cosmos made of those Lego pieces, then it is a changeable creation. It is expanding creation. It is improving creation. And it is not something where we want to arrive at the end of it, because then creation ceases to expand. Right now, we are still in the expansion of creation. There are also times in cosmos when creation goes into the opposite direction and it goes back into source itself. But that's not again the goal. Creation itself doesn't have a goal. It is one could say creation doesn't really need a goal. It simply is. It doesn't try to achieve something, but it has fun playing the game of Leela, giving rise to worlds, dissolving worlds, giving rise to worlds, enjoying them, changing them, dissolving them. So that is how creation works. So right now we are in the out breath. So we are still in the expansion of creation. And it originally was intended, if there was any intention, for this to be entertaining, for this to be fun, for this not to be serious. And so you see what happened on planet Earth is quite a different version of it. Now we are going through this amazing opportunity as a collective to restore our conscious awareness of our divine self. Many teachings in this world, spiritual teachings, didn't even know about the existence of the divine self. They focused on different layers of our being. Very often they talked about the higher self, then they talked about the soul. Very often misunderstood that the highest level of our being has always been the I am, the divine self, the spirit self. So when we look at what is the person that we are, the person in this world is layers. In this world, as a person, we have a body. There is a body that we use to get around. There is a body that is anchoring something here. It's anchoring our experience. But what is operating the body? It is not the food, it's not the air, it's even not even the heartbeat. Because as mystics, we can even transcend all of it. So, what is operating this being? What is creating the person? Ultimately, it is the light of the divine self that gives us existence. This light is what animates us, and it is being filtered into the person through the soul. The soul is the intermediary between the person and the divine self. Each play a different role, but the most eternal aspect of us, the highest of the highest of us, is always the divine self. The divine self is the source of consciousness, and that is what animates us through the filter of the soul. The soul has a different purpose than the divine self, and it is the divine self that created the soul. The soul is created as a stepping down process of something smaller and yet immeasurable in terms of size. And then through that, the light of the divine self shines through, and then it shines through the soul into the person down here, and that animates us. This structure has always existed, and yet the human being went through a very long period of disconnecting from the divine self, and yet still existing because of the consciousness of the divine self. The human being cannot exist without the divine self, and the divine self exists without the human being. We are not necessary. The divine self doesn't need us, and yet in a way, we originated in the divine self, not as a body, not as a person, not as a personality, but we originate as consciousness, which then creates light. And that light is always emanated permanently, eternally, unchangingly by the divine self. The divine self then creates a smaller body that we call the soul on the soul plane, but the soul is not as eternal if we had to measure it and compare it as the divine self. So the level of the divine self is the highest, the absolute, eternal, and also infinite, because you cannot measure the absolute. And so it's also infinite. Whereas the soul is a more individualized body of energy. It doesn't have arms and doesn't have legs. It's not a person. The soul is not a person. Even the soul doesn't need us to exist. It actually exists independently of the person, and yet we could not exist without the soul. So we depend on the light of the soul. We depend on the consciousness of the divine self. So that's why we are the most temporary occurrence within the structure. If we were able to be fully connected to the divine self that we belong to, we cannot really say that we are the divine self, but we are an aspect, little temporary occurrence that is fueled by the consciousness of the divine self. So we belong to a divine self, and within the divine self, we actually cease to exist. Maybe we could call it samadhi. Within the divine self, we no longer have our own personality self that would be separate from the divine self. We cease to exist as a personality self. So I would assume that we could label that from the mystical terms as samadhi. It is the experience of the infinite, absolute, thoughtless divine self. Now, if the person believes some kind of delusion, which I think we all do at this point still, then we have some kind of layers between us and the divine self. And these layers are layers of delusion. I call it nonsense, but we believe it. So I think we all believe some nonsense or a lot of nonsense because of the nature of our false matrix reality, our samsara that we experienced for so many thousands and maybe even millions of years. So all this nonsense is simply false beliefs. And that includes our belief in our existence. If we define it by the body, if we call that life, if we call birth and death the beginning and the end, that is a nonsense that separates us from the truth of the divine self, which has never, ever, ever identified with any of that. To that divine self, that's non-existent, because that never even affected the divine self in any way. So you see, there is a lot that we will be undoing here. There were several beings who operated the system to trap these immortal beings that we actually are in the dark web, truly like a spider web, and to trap them in that delusion and culturalizing them, giving them information that was repeated again and again and again until that information became a belief. And then the collective of humanity would believe the same stuff, and it created a collective unconscious mind. And by repeating it generation to generation, then it would just sink in and it would become our reality. And we would call it normal. Anything that we called normal and we believed it as a collective we can probably identify that as a delusion. And so there will be a lot of dissolving, a lot of undoing. As you know, until recently, there was a force in this cosmos that was actually a natural consequence of the Lego box opening. When the Lego box of the creator opened, some pieces didn't want to be part of the creation. Some pieces wanted to actually create their own little world separate from the oneness of all life. And so until recently, that was definitely a force within this creation, and we knew it as the adversary. The adversary we also know as Satan, but again, it's not exactly that it's just one being. It's so much more of a force that created beings. And so this force was holding this world separate by a membrane that surrounded this world. And it created even the wheel of karma and also what we know as karmic reincarnation, having to come back due to cause and effect. Our divine self is beyond cause and effect. The divine self is actually motionless. And so it doesn't need to create anything that would complete it or make it more of itself. It already is complete and it doesn't need any outcomes. The divine self cannot be corrupted. It is incorruptible. And so the divine self doesn't operate the same way that we do, especially when it comes to cause and effect. Within the divine self, duality doesn't exist. Within the divine self, delusions do not exist. And there is only one little thing about the existence of the divine self, and that is that one big light became many small lights. So when these lights got trapped not at the level of the divine self, but at the level of the person. Only at the level of the person could one be trapped. No one can trap the divine self. So that again, it's great news that no one can trap the divine self. Isn't that amazing? So this is a picture that you will still see, I'm sure, in a lot of Tibetan maybe drawings depicting this beast holding the world in samsara, but that again doesn't apply anymore. So we are in a different system right now, but this system was not only working around us, but it also started to work through us and within us, through our lower human personality mind. Now, I'm going to take a guess, and that would be that we all know really well the personality, human, third dimensional mind that operates disconnected from the divine self. I'm going to give an example. How does this mind operate? It is the mind that we didn't have as small children, but we developed it. Many different forces wanted us to develop the mind the way it did, because it is, after all, mind and time false matrix. So the mind had to be captured. It worked really, I would say, reliably, but not in our favor. The mind got captured by the system. And so that lower personality mind is always thinking. And it is thinking thoughts that we might even say are my thoughts. And we would say, I am thinking. These are my thoughts. I am thinking about my life. I am thinking about my past. I am thinking about my future. I am thinking about my present, but actually without being present. So that is the lower personality, mind, completely trapped by the system, by the web that wanted us to be trapped by it. So anytime we are thinking like that, which I think might be quite a bit, and maybe even all the time when we are awake, then we are simply feeding duality. We are feeding delusion. We are making more of it. And why are we making more of it? Because we actually are creator beings. Some people in the past started to say things like, I am God. But actually, that's not exactly true, because that would be comparing yourself to the absolute and the infinite. But we are all fractals of the divine, tiny little fractals. And so, yes, we do have amazing potential within us to be godlike. We have the great gifts within us. And within these gifts, we have an amazing gift. And that is the gift of the Creator, and to be using the higher mind to create higher realities. But because it's a gift, and the system that we have been part of knew it, it knew how to trick us into lowering the higher mind to the lower mind, and then possessing it with thoughts of past, of so-called present without actually being present, and then thoughts of future. Sometimes good thoughts, sometimes positive thoughts, very often also not very nice thoughts, and sometimes very scary thoughts. And so it actually trapped the mind in this wheel of samsara. So that is the delusion that has lived within us, and most probably it still lives within us all. I compare it to a cage, where if you are spending many, many, many lifetimes within a cage, the cage actually is invisible, that you will never notice it unless you do some transformational work within yourself and you wake up to the truth of your divine self, and then you will see what really took place. And so if we live so many lifetimes here since we had that false reincarnation cycle, then everything will seem so normal. It's normal to be like this. It's normal to be thinking. It's normal to have thoughts about past, present, and future. But actually, it's not our true nature. Our true nature, as you know, is only one and only nature, and that is the nature of the divine self. The divine self doesn't think, and that might sound very strange. Why is the divine self not thinking about anything? Because it's present. It is eternally present, not with this present moment, but it is the eternal now. The divine self doesn't know time, that is timelessness. And so the time that we have here doesn't touch the divine self. The divine self doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end. It contains both at the same time within itself. And that's why it is eternal. Again, we've had some teachings about being present and focusing on the now, this moment. I'm talking, you listening, maybe you're doing something else. But that is, again, part of the delusion. The real presence is eternity. And so it's actually, instead of contracting to this one little moment, it's an expansion to all that is and always has been. So that, you see, is very different. And we are now dissolving this delusion that has lived within us for so long, and we are deconstructing our reality. And we will do it gently, because it's a big quantum leap from what we have been used to for so long. And, generations upon generations have been used to it. And so now it's a big quantum leap. It's freedom. And it is not a freedom that we were told that we had. Maybe the politicians that are part of the delusion without even knowing it. They are just like us. Sometimes people talk about deep state and stuff like that. It's all just delusion. The real forces that were manipulating this world were not politicians. They were not deep state. They were behind the scene, the invisible, the forces, not even of human origin, in the interdimensional spaces around the earth that permeated everything on this planet. Because a very easy way to manipulate someone is when you are invisible, but you have influence upon them. That's actually genius, but of course not in our favor. So everything has been part of the delusion, and now is the time of deconstructing delusion so that true freedom is re experienced. We will get to experience true freedom that can only be found in the divine self. The divine self is completely free. It never has been bound by anything, and no experience has affected the divine self. So true freedom is not political freedom. True freedom is not financial freedom. True freedom is not the conditions that we create within delusion. True freedom is when one is one with divine self. Sometimes mystics, when they self-realize the divine self, they said, and now I am so free that I can even be a prisoner and I am still completely free. So that's how big that freedom is. Nothing can affect the freedom of the divine self. In the tarot card, the divine self is represented by the Fool. So the 0 in the tarot cards is the beginning and the end. And the Fool is not foolish, but it is the one who is so free that one could say, how come nothing matters to the Fool? Nothing matters to the Fool. The Fool is now awake in the divine play. And so the Fool can now play anything, any character, and the Fool can truly shake the delusion in everyone around them by knowing who they are. The divine self is not exactly what we think it is, because we expect certain behaviors from a person who embodied the divine self. But the divine self is so spontaneous that it is available to any action and any reaction at any given moment without any expectations of any outcomes. The divine self can even shake everyone around them out of delusion. It can have behaviors that might be shocking, never harmful, never ever causing any harm. But it can be the Fool, available to the divine play, to truly be played. So we've had some mystics and many different forms and many different behaviors, many different styles. And it truly was the divine self moving through them. So as human beings coming from the delusion, we might have expectations how that should look like. But again, the divine self is completely free, and it inspires the one who's connected to the divine self to be whatever the divine self wants them to be an instrument of God. Some people say that when Jesus was here on this planet, that sometimes he would, get angry even. And that's totally just the divine self doing whatever it tool wants to use. It wants to use any tool it can to wake everyone else from delusion. So again, it's without expectation to certain behaviors. When I was traveling out of body, when we still had the false matrix was like a structure that was actually not visible. And so when a person went out of body, and many people would report the same thing, we would end up in these very dilapidated buildings. And it seemed like we can't escape these buildings, out of body buildings. They were not real physical buildings here, but that were very real buildings in the interdimensional spaces around the earth and around humanity. And millions of people would be drawn to these buildings where they would, with their tricked mind, be empowering certain structures and realities and timelines in this world. And all of it was operating unconsciously and yet intentionally. Intentionally when it came to those who created the system, but for us, humanity, unconsciously. So let's say these beings now are still around. These structures have fallen, and these structures have been dissolving and dissolved, but the beings are still attempting to trick humankind into certain timelines. So, how would you do it? Well, you would definitely use things like social media, news, what people believe. You would want people to empower certain timelines if you want them to come into manifestation. So I would say at this moment, if I was to give an advice to all of us in this world, I would say do not believe anything that comes from delusion and just stick to your divine self. Every day we have many hours when we can do things with our life. And so I would say right now, this is very, very important focus time. Focus on the divine self. Talk to your divine self. Be one with your divine self. And, it's a learning curve how not to believe anything right now, because there is still force that wants to sway people to a different timeline. It's almost like wants to hijack us to a different timeline. So we don't want that, of course. And this goes, of course, can come from also spiritual channels and spiritual stuff. So there is one truth, and that one truth is Source itself that fractalized into our divine selves. So that one is such reliable source of our own knowing. And there is a process of aligning with the divine self, of course, because we want to definitely make sure we are aligned with the divine self and nothing else at this moment. This will truly change our lives. Today we are not going to be meditating here together, but we will do a lot of meditations in the next few weeks, especially as we move towards December solstice, because it's going to be a huge breakthrough again, not because of some date, but the solstice exists beyond time. We are trapped in the false time, and many beings in this world, of course, realized it. Jose Arguelles was one of the beings who was teaching about true time and false time. He was the father of harmonic convergence. And the reason for that is that the false matrix introduced every possible way of manipulating our minds so that we forget completely who we truly are, and instead believe completely with conviction that we are a person who is in a body on this planet, that we had a wonderful birth, and that maybe it will be scary death and loss, and that in between is a life. So that's what the false matrix wanted us to believe. The false matrix really wanted us to believe linear time, and so it introduced linear time. The false matrix didn't want us to know anything about ancient civilizations. And so it started from zero, 2025 years ago. It gave us all these false narratives that we evolved from the caveman. It deleted our ancient past. It deleted our cosmic origin. It deleted our other experiences and civilizations. And it gave us jobs. It gave us education. It gave us this little small unit that we call family. And it gave us roles. It gave us roles. And then it gave us 8 hours of work a day where we earn living, so that we can pay for stuff. And so you see, it had many, many, many different ways. And it made us feel so separate from each other instead of one family of humanity. So the force that was manipulating us from behind the scenes, it looked like a black giant spider weaving the web, trapping all these wonderful immortal beings to some extent in this web, not the web of life, but the web of the false matrix. And so it made sure that we all fall for it. And one of the things, of course, that it used not only our lower human mind, the personality mind, but it also used false time and false calendar, false measuring of time. So right now, I don't know, but I think that maybe 8.5 billion people in this world believe that this is the year 2025 and that it's ingrained in us and that we started to measure time from zero and that this is the one and only civilization. I know you don't believe it and you know that there is so much more to it. But again, I would say billions of people believe that this is this incredibly advanced civilization and that nothing came before us except for the cavemen. So you see, the trickery was very big. But what happens on and before and after, the day before, the day after solstice, is that this world had, no matter how much it was manipulated, no matter how much we had false measuring of time, no matter how we disconnected from the cosmic cycle, this world still experienced freedom from false time on and around solstice. Not just December, but both solstices. Our June solstice, our December solstice. So on solstice, false time stopped working. So it stopped working. You know, our civilizations, of course, go millions of years back, not thousands. And we didn't start as cavemen. We started as unbelievably evolved beings of light, incredibly evolved. The most evolved we have ever been on this planet is the beginning when we were beings of light. So imagine. Today is much more dedicated to recognizing or beginning to recognize the delusion that has run so deep in all our lives, in every aspect of our life, even our spirituality, of course. And so we are learning that there is an aspect of us, which is the divine self, which has never, ever, ever been and never will be part of delusion. When we put invisible cage around the world, including the interdimensional spaces around the world, which also includes other dimension, not just this realm, but other realms, and we put the invisible cage around, and then we will have many, many so-called incarnations and reincarnations into this realm. So the status quo will be, this is what you get. But nobody can see the cage, so we must be free. So then in this free world, we will think it is free and we will try to find comfort. Because this world, by design, it was actually created originally as a perfect world, then later trapped, and then within the trap, comfort and discomfort were introduced artificially as a duality, so that we always seek comfort and dislike discomfort. That was how the mind was trapped. It is how also the trap worked through the physical body, seeking comfort, disliking discomfort. When a mystic, a true divine mystic, woke up from this delusion and they would realize how it operates, they no longer identified with comfort and discomfort. They no longer felt any attachment to comfort and no resistance to discomfort, because they realize it's part of the delusion. So you will see many, many teachings in this world, including, of course, Yogananda, Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, many teachings from all traditions. They found the same thing, Sufism including. Those are just the ones that I'm familiar with. There must be, so many more. So they realized that duality is the trap, and that one has to transcend duality, including comfort and discomfort. And not because one would suddenly say, oh, I'm okay suffering, but because they realize that it is a process of delusion, trying to make us seek only one side of the coin and to resist the other. So the divine self doesn't seek comfort. Divine self is pure comfort, always, eternally. It never experienced any discomfort because it exists beyond duality. Within the divine self are all solutions to all things already complete, and nothing needs to be figured out. So when we start truly experiencing our divine self and we surrender, surrender is not a difficult act. It's just fall into the arms of your divine self. Let go. It is about not holding on to delusion. Maybe we all, to some extent, are clinging to the delusion because it was so familiar. But surrender is a wonderful act of letting go. Surrender is falling, free falling, into the arms of your divine self and saying, here I am. I'm all yours. And so within the divine self, there is no clinging, there is no need, there is no wanting. It already all is what it is. It's all complete and wonderful. So the wisest thing to do as a human being at this very moment and moving forward is to recover the connection with the divine self and make it our full consciousness, so that we don't get stuck in the unconscious survival of the false matrix. The unconscious human being is seeking comfort by creating conditions, looking for conditions. It could be very simply saying, I will have comfort when I am financially free. I will have comfort when I'm in the right relationship and I have a loved one. I will have comfort when I have achieved something in this world. I will feel satisfied with myself. And yet all of that is delusion and a trick. The divine self is not seeking anything at all. It already is all. I am that I am. I am. And so I will share all the different wonderful techniques that I found, not only through Orin, but through Yogananda also, how the divine self can be fully, fully, fully self-realized. One could even say attained, but all of this language is just to help us understand, because we already are the divine self. So maybe it's just remembering who we truly are. Within the delusion, we always had the good and the bad. It was by design. It was the design of the false matrix. Give them a little bit of good, give them a little bit of bad. Give them a little bit of comfort, give them a little bit of discomfort. Give them a little bit of health, give them a little bit of disease. Give them birth, give them death. Give them joy, give them sorrow. Give them likes, give them dislikes. And so it created this good and bad duality as a trap. The mystics who woke up from the trap and they realized it, they only had one answer, and that would sound like maybe. So the typical personality self sees something bad and they say, that's bad. And the mystic would say, maybe. And then the same person sees something that they call good. And the mystic says, maybe. Then again, the person sees something and they say, that's terrible, that's tragic, that's horrible. And the mystic says, maybe. It is basically like Rumi, where you have the beautiful poems from Rumi, who was an incredible embodiment of his divine self, along the same lines as the avatars that we've had, like Yogananda or Lao Tzu, that there is a field beyond the good and bad. And Rumi says, I will meet you there. So right now, the divine play is playing out here too. And it's using everyone who's available to be a character, to be the fool, to be the instrument, to be the one that the divine self can play through, to bring about the happy end, the freedom, the true freedom. Because now is the time that it will actually happen, because the source of the adversary ceased to exist. Our mind, when we are trapped in the delusion, is constantly going and going and going, and it's going from the past into the future, it's going from the good to the bad, it's going from the positive to the negative, it's going from strong to weak. So that is the constant oscillation between the two sides, keeping us trapped in duality. You can very easily tell when you are thinking thoughts of the lower human self, which I'm sure that we all do, because that's all we have known, except for when we were little kids. When a little kid is feeling discomfort, they feel discomfort. It is a physical sensation that they have. But when an adult is feeling discomfort, they will have thoughts about it. And that will be so much going on in the mind. So it's not an experience anymore. Now it's a commentary. The mind is commenting on things. So for us to seize this is not very easy. Even Yogananda said it took him 2 years of daily practice. And, it's decades ago, but still, it took him 2 years to completely stop the pendulum from swinging. So again, we'll be patient with our own process, but it's good to know when we are thinking about past, when we thinking even thoughts of deep satisfaction, as long as we thinking, then we are in the false, trapped personality mind. The divine self is thoughtless. It's not a thinker, but it is also a mind of God. And mind of God is the mind of inspiration. It's a mind of complete solutions all the time. And it is a mind of invention. It might have new inspiration all the time without thought. So there is a difference between how the divine mind operates and the difference between how the lower human mind operates. So paying attention whether we are inspired and then called into action or not. We don't always have to be in action, because the divine self does not have a plan. It doesn't want to achieve anything. It already always has been achieved without doing. But it might inspire you or me or someone here to actually act. Act without effort. Act without even doing. Act just simply by being, expressing what the divine self wants to express with complete non-attachment. There is no clinging. It has no agenda. It doesn't even seek certain outcomes. But if inspiration comes and moves you, then be available and do if doing is what it wants to do. So I think about, like our jobs. If you have a job or if you've had job, how we were told to do sometimes 8 hours a day doing, that's not the divine self at all. The divine self is spontaneous all the time, and it might call us into doing, but it also might not call us into doing anything. Whatever arises will arise, and then we go with the flow, and when the flow stops, we also stop. So being efficient, or whatever the word was, productive, is not the divine self. There is no productivity within the divine self, and yet a lot can be done. So like Yogananda, he would constantly be writing and writing poems and teaching and lecturing, but one day the divine self said, I don't feel like it anymore. It's not what I want to be doing in this world anymore. So Yogananda said, okay, he withdrew, that's it. He didn't do any more lectures. And the divine self, now I want you to write a lot. So he would write a lot, but he would stop lecturing. So it was so much about just where the flow goes, the being goes too. So it is about being inspired. It is divine inspiration. Tao Te Ching, I always say translated by Stephen Mitchell, is a wonderful Bible of the divine self. Bhagavad Gita, I love the translations by Stephen Mitchell. Again, you can get those as audiobooks. I recommend listening again and again. Those are incredible teachings of the divine self. And so in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu is a nickname for the divine self, says, caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. So that's only the world of illusion. But free from desire, you realize the mystery. Now, earlier on this call, someone asked, well, what if you have a desire to become your divine self? That is desire. But it's an interesting thing. Because if you think of our entire structure as a body, then the divine self already is part of the body. So we don't need a desire to have something since it already is part of the body. And it's just about really realizing it, that it already is part of the body. So desire seems something like we would be reaching for something that we don't have just yet, but we already are an aspect of the divine self, and the divine self already is the highest aspect of our being. So we are not separate. So now it's just about expanding our own being from the little human personality self. It's a big stretch, isn't it? It's an expansion of our awareness. Can we be aware of the divine self as the source of our consciousness? And of course we can. Only then we realize the mystery, free from desire. Now, sometimes we hear the word illusion and we hear the word delusion. So let's take a look at the difference. And that will be close to our closing here, but I want to record it all so that we have it. In Cosmos, if we take the box of the Lego pieces, when we open the box, there are so many pieces, but they all used to be one box. Now, when you open the box, suddenly you have illusion. That means many Lego pieces that used to be in one box. So it's a beautiful trick. You open the box and like a magician, there are many, many pieces. That is a force. It's a nature. It's simply power of the creator. Source itself creates many fractals of itself, and yet they are all one. They cannot be separate. They are all from oneness and always remain part of the oneness, no matter how far they go. Oneness is something that is unchangeable. All these puzzle pieces, the little pieces of the Lego, belong to the oneness of that one box. So that is Maya. That is God's dream, where one is dreaming many. Delusion is actually completely different. Delusion is not illusion. Illusion is something that will not change within creation as long as creation is expanding into more of itself, and it's wonderful. It gives us actually the opportunity to exist as a gift. But delusion is when you have people in this world and they believe that the unreal is real. And that is delusion. When my divine self first was showing me all of this, the divine self is not a she or a he. It doesn't have a body, it doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a shape. And so when the divine self is infinite consciousness moving through us, teaching us, because it contains all the teachings, not just any, it has everything. It contains everything of what we would call the truth. So the divine self would say, we are like dreamers who forgot that they are dreaming. We are like actors in a movie, but we forgot that we are actors, and so we take it too seriously, as if it was real. Again, if you compare it to like a movie, and the actor in the movie would forget that they are actually an actor, and they would start believing that the character is real, we would call them delusional. And so that is delusion. Believing that the unreal is real. The delusion goes very deep, of course, in this world. And I think, again, all of us have many layers of delusion within us. And that's okay, because now is the time of liberation. So we will be changing our perception of reality. We will be even changing our perception of who we are. Part of the delusion is that if I am watching a movie, which it is, and I call it real, then I will have some kind of desire for the movie to change if I don't like it. And I will be pointing at the screen and I will say, change, change, I don't like it. But again, that's delusion. The only thing that can change is our perception. We talk about consciousness, unconsciousness. So unconsciousness is delusion. Consciousness is knowing that the divine self is the true self. There are maybe for each one of us zillions of layers of delusion. But hopefully there is optimism in all of this, and that is the divine self. The divine self is victorious, always. When we reach for the divine self that is already within us, it manifests within us, through us, above us, into the highest aspects of our being that is not only this one little person down here. The divine self is in no way limited by our person. The person happens to be just a tiny little aspect of the divine self. And so when the little person down here comes to wisdom and reaches for the highest of what they already are, the divine self never says no to us. It pierces through every layer of delusion, through the pillar of light that goes through the spine, and of course through the heart as well. And it liberates our being if we ask. And so I recommend every single day saying, Divine Self, I am ready to be fully liberated from all delusion that I have believed and made mine, because we made the delusion ours. Our beliefs, our stories, our histories, our fears, our satisfaction, our comfort, our discomfort, all of it is our delusion. And so when we surrender it to the divine self is like a sword of truth. It cuts through all delusions and it rescues us from our delusions, and we have nothing to lose and everything to gain. There is only one power in all of cosmos, and that power is the power of the divine self. That power cannot be diminished by even zillions upon zillions of layers of delusion. When the divine self is asked to move through us, it will dissolve all delusions when we say we are ready. When we say we are ready, it will do it for us like the greatest love that has been waiting for us to give it the permission and to knock so that the doors can open. So we are waking up from a very long sleep where we forgot that reality is a dream and that we are dreamers. There are many different wonderful writings by Yogananda when he speaks to the Lord. There are wonderful writings like the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching. And this is one of my favorite, one of many favorite quotes from Yogananda when he speaks to the Lord. And the Lord says to him, "The tragedy of death is unreal. Those who shudder at it are like an ignorant actor who dies of fright on the stage when nothing more has been fired at him than a blank cartridge, a blank bullet." So we take our roles so seriously. That's part of the delusion, because delusion only works if we take it seriously. The moment that we become the fool, the delusion cannot get to us because we will laugh in its face. Knowing who we truly are, nothing can scare us. Fear is, of course, the toxin of delusion. Within the truth of the divine self, there is no fear, nothing to be feared, not even death, because we realize, of course, that the tragedy of death was part of delusion, and not just that, so much more. So, let me see. We only have a few more slides. I know it's a very long call today. I apologize. So, temptation is not exactly what we think it is. But a temptation is any time when the world wants us to believe that it is real and wants us to like it or dislike it, so that we react to it emotionally, so that we worry about it or we feel deeply satisfied about it. That all is the real meaning of temptation. That means I'm watching a movie and I believe it is so real that it has an effect on me. And now I have an emotional reaction and I like the world, don't like the world, I want the world to change. That all is temptation. The divine self is unchanging, unchangeable, and yet when it moves through you as inspiration, it might inspire you to be the change you want to see. So there are certain dichotomies. The divine self is the pillar of light. That's why, for example, we practice Kriya Yoga. We practice different types of meditation where we do pranayama through the spine. It eventually leads, of course, to out-of-body experiences because the body itself is just a little container containing our consciousness, and yet consciousness cannot be contained by the body. This is from the works of Orin, and I really like this, especially the way that Orin expresses it. "O divine self that I am, assist me. I cannot do it on my own. I, the personality." And so we are asking the divine self every day, surrender. I surrender my all delusions to you, divine self, because you cannot be affected by them, but we have been affected by them. But the divine self is the only self, the I am, that actually can liberate us. We cannot do it on our own. The divine self is the liberating light of truth that cuts through the delusion. Again, surrender is not difficult. It simply means relax, let go, trust, which means love, and surrender. And without love, we are not an open system. Everything is about openness to the divine self. If I'm empty, if I'm actually filled with love, I become empty of the false self. That's why love has always been the key. Love is much more than we can imagine. It is the key that unlocks this ability to receive the fullness of the light. When we are in love with life, when we are in love with Divine Mother, when we are in love with the mystery, when we are in love with Shiva, with the Creator, with Source itself, when we are in love with the Divine Self that we are, then that love expands us, opens us up, and then simply the law of nature is when we are open and free, the light of the Divine Self fills us up. And so it is.